Thank you. All right, well, I think we'll get going. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our BEAD update webinar for February. Thank you all for joining this afternoon. My name is Colin Robbins. I'm the director of our Telecom and NUSF department here with the Public Service Commission. And a little bit of housekeeping, I guess, before we get too far into things. First of all, this is a webinar that is being recorded. We will post copies of the recording on both the broadband.nebraska.gov website and the Public Service Commission's website. So you should be able to find copies of the presentation there once we have it all ready to go. Next thing, just ask again that you stay muted, and if you have questions, you're welcome to enter those into the chat as they come up. Otherwise, we will have some time likely at the end of the webinar for live Q&A if people want to ask questions directly. You'll see on the screen there the Connect Nebraska at nebraska.gov email address. Please send an email to that if you want to be added to the contact list. You can also send emails directly to me and we will add you to our listserv. Just a couple more comments on the listserv. We are providing notification of these webinars via the listserv, and if you want to be added, again, contact me, and there are options to be taken off that list if you don't want to be part of the outreach from the listserv. This is our agenda for today. We will hear about digital equity today from Ann Byers. She's been heading up that portion of the NTIA program, the digital equity portion, and she will give us an overview of what digital equity is and what will be going on through the digital equity planning process in coming months. And then I plan on giving kind of a deeper dive into the 5-year plan and what we envision occurring for what will happen for input to the 5-year plan and kind of where we see things fitting together. So first thing I wanted to announce that's new since last month is that we have our outreach coordinator on board. And Rachel, I don't know, hopefully you're maybe in front of a camera and can click off the video. There she is. We're excited to have Rachel on board as our outreach coordinator. Just a heads up that people might start to see correspondence from Rachel. She will be reaching out to groups and entities as we move along through the planning process. And second thing on Rachel, she is working very hard on an outreach plan that we will undertake soon. So hopefully we'll have a lot more details on what our outreach efforts will consist of for you, hopefully next month. Okay. Quick review. Wanted to do a quick review of what we discussed last month. We mentioned that there was the broadband office was created via executive order. There's a companion bill, I think it was introduced prior to our last meeting, LB 683, that was introduced that also kind of codifies in statute at least the responsibilities of the broadband office. There was a hearing held on February 7th on that bill. I just operating off my recollection, there were maybe 4 entities in support and then several that testified in a neutral capacity. Don't recall if there's any opposition. That bill has not moved out of committee yet, and we expect that if it does, there will likely have to be some amendments. So just that's where that's at today. I think we mentioned last month that there were several challenges to the FCC broadband map that were submitted. Those were availability challenges, and those are still kind of being worked on both by us and by the FCC. So no updates other than to just mention that those were submitted. Next item, we have engaged a mapping vendor. Vitro Fiber Map is the name of the company. And so we have started working with them to develop a new state broadband map. In the very early stages of that, but I'm hopeful that sooner rather than later we'll have some things to show people as we go along in developing that broadband map. Last kind of update, I think we mentioned last month that the Capital Projects Fund grant cycle was set to begin. We are now accepting applications for that grant program, and applications are due on Friday. So hopefully for those of you that are planning to submit, that's not new news, but 24th is the deadline for those applications, and we hope that we will have awards made, awards announced by the end of June for capital projects funds. So looking forward to seeing what we get for applications. We will have on our existing state broadband map, at least the areas that were applied for up by late next week. So just something to keep your eye out for. That we both publish the applications that we receive on our website, and we show the areas on our broadband map. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Ann Byers to give us some information on digital equity and the digital equity planning grant. So I will, Ann, I'll advance slides as you tell me to. So
okay, great. Thank you, Colin. Thank you for inviting me to talk about the State Digital Equity Planning Grant. As Colin mentioned, my name is Ann Byers. I'm with the Nebraska Information Technology Commission and Office of the CIO, and I'm heading up the State Digital Equity Planning Grant. Next slide, Colin. So today I'm going to talk about what is digital equity, why it's important, connectivity and device gaps, the priority or covered populations that we will be focusing on, and our planning activities. Next slide, please. So what is digital equity? Digital equity is the goal of achieving parity in digital participation in the economy and society, and includes making sure that everyone has connectivity to the internet, the appropriate digital devices, and the skills to use these technologies, including knowing how to use privacy and security practices. Next slide. But the grant is really a little bit bigger than just digital equity. It also is about increasing digital opportunities. And digital opportunities expresses a broader vision of enabling Nebraskans to grow our economy, improve access to healthcare, increase educational opportunities, and improve the lives of Nebraskans. So next slide. And while the BEAD grant focuses on increasing broadband availability, the State Digital Equity Planning Grant focuses on increasing adoption and the use of internet technologies. And you really need both broadband availability and adoption to realize the benefits of broadband. I like to think that digital equity is the chocolate to BEAD's peanut butter. They are better together. And here's why broadband availability and adoption are important. Next slide. The first reason is broadband availability and adoption are important for our economy. There are a number of studies on this topic, but I'm just going to cite one. A 2021 Deloitte study found that increased broadband subscription, greater broadband availability, and greater subscription of higher speed broadband lead to economic growth. You need all three. Next slide. Broadband availability and adoption are also important for agriculture. A USDA study found that fully adopting next generation precision agriculture technologies in the US would result in annual gross benefits of $13 billion for row crops and $20.6 billion for livestock and dairy. Next slide. And Nebraska is actually a leader in the use of precision agriculture technologies. We're fourth currently in the United States, behind North Dakota, South Dakota, and Iowa. And we have 51% of our farmers and ranchers using precision agriculture practices to manage crops or livestock. But we still have a long way to go to get to 100% to full adoption. And next slide. Broadband availability and adoption are also important for health. There are a couple recent studies that show just how big an impact broadband can have on health. One study found that places with lower internet subscription rates had higher COVID-19 mortality rates, especially in urban areas. And I think this finding seems shocking, but it makes sense. Without internet access, it would be much harder to get accurate information about COVID-19, to schedule a vaccine, to access healthcare services, to keep in touch with family and friends, to participate in religious services, clubs that might have gone online, online classes, all these kinds of things that help keep us emotionally and physically healthy. And a second study found that COVID-19 patients who used a remote health monitoring portal had a 32% lower rate of hospitalization on average than other COVID-19 patients. Portal users that did require hospitalization were discharged from hospitals 2.7 days sooner on average. And I think that we're going to see a big increase in the use of remote health monitoring in the future, but we need broadband for that. Next slide. And today, really, both mobile and home connectivity are important for full digital participation. Since the COVID-19 pandemic and with all the current labor shortages, more and more organizations are moving services and applications online. And some applications are best done using a larger device and home connectivity, applications like doing homework or applying for a job in particular. Some applications, such as checking in for a medical appointment, getting directions, or showing a digital ticket at an event, require a mobile device and access. And those without both kinds of connectivity and devices may experience difficulties accessing services and participating fully in the digital economy and society. Next slide. So how big is the connectivity and device gap in Nebraska? If you look at the slide, I know the numbers are a little small, but hopefully you can see them. But approximately 9.9, or just about under 10% of Nebraska households lack internet access at home. But another 22.3% only have home or mobile access. So altogether, nearly a third of Nebraska households may not have the connectivity they need to fully participate in the digital economy and society. And unfortunately, the connectivity gap is even bigger in rural counties of the state. And we're counting all of our counties except Douglas, Sarpy, Lancaster, and Hall as being rural counties. So in the rural counties, 13.5% of households lack internet access at home, and another 27.2% have only home or mobile connectivity. So just over 40% of rural households may not have the connectivity that they need. Next slide. Now we're going to look at the device gap. And it's similar. We also see that rural counties have a higher device gap than the state and urban counties. So in the state, 7.2% of households have no digital devices, with another 13.5% having only one kind of digital device. This is from the U.S. Census American Community Survey, and they didn't ask if you had multiple cell phones, just if you had at least one cell phone. So we don't really know exactly how many devices. We just have an idea of the kinds of devices. And 20.7% of Nebraska households So in total, 20.7% of Nebraska households may not have access to all the devices that they need to fully participate digitally. And then in rural Nebraska counties, 9.7% of households have no digital device, and 16.7% of households have only one kind of device. So over a quarter of households in rural Nebraska may not have the devices that they need. So next slide. We're also required to address the needs of 8 priority or covered populations. And altogether, 75% of almost 75% of Nebraska's population falls into one or more of those covered populations. The largest covered population is rural residents with 36.2% of Nebraska's population. And then the next largest is those 60 years or over. That's 22.5% of Nebraska's population. Other covered populations are members of racial or ethnic minorities, low-income households, those with language barriers, those with a disability, veterans, and incarcerated individuals. Next slide. Of all the covered population, older adults and those with lower incomes are the least likely to be connected. 27% of Nebraskans age 65 and older do not have an internet connection at home, and 37% of Nebraska households with household income of less than $20,000 do not have an internet connection at home. Next slide. Now I'm going to start talking about the state digital equity plan. Nebraska received a $600,000 state digital equity planning grant from the NTIA to develop a state digital equity plan. The digital equity planning grant started on December 1st, 2022, and the state digital equity plan must be submitted by November 30th, 2023. States can receive $7.2 million or more over 5 years to set up a state digital equity grant program to support the implementation of their plan. And so states might have their grant programs going up in 2024. That's just kind of a guesstimate right now. So next slide. Some of our planning activities include working with the state's economic development districts to form regional digital equity planning committees, and then each of those groups is going to develop a regional digital equity plan. We've been having weekly, or actually near weekly, we're taking a few bi-weeks, weekly webinars on topics associated with digital equity. We're also completing an inventory of digital equity assets and best practices. We're contracting with the University of Nebraska at Lincoln in Omaha to do a survey and to do a few focus groups. We're planning some outreach activities in conjunction with BEAD. And then we're also planning to have a state planning conference to bring together representatives of the regional digital equity planning committees, any tribal governments that have developed digital equity plans, any local governments that have developed digital equity plans, and possibly a few other key stakeholders to a state planning conference to talk about recommendations for the state plan. And next slide. So there are numerous ways you can participate. I think probably the most important way is I would invite all of you to participate in regional planning groups. You're welcome to join us for our webinars on most Wednesdays at 11 a.m. If you have information on digital equity assets and best practices, please share them with me and with the regional planning groups. We invite you to participate in any outreach activities, and we are required to have a 30-day comment period. So I invite you to submit comments during that comment period on the plan, or just reach out to us and ask us questions, and tell us what kind of activities you have going on, what kind of concerns you have. And on the next slide, I have my contact information. So, please feel free to reach out to me. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Ann. I think it might make sense if we just pause for a second to see if there are any questions for Ann at this point. I didn't see any in the chat, but I did have one question for you. On the slide where it talks about covered populations, one of the categories was rural. And does that sort of fit the same definition that you gave earlier on what is considered rural?
Close. I was using county data when I came up with those charts. So the definition is communities of 50,000, well, urban areas are considered communities of 50,000 or more, and contiguous urbanized areas. So that would be the Omaha area, Lincoln, Grand Island, and South Sioux City.
Okay.
And then all other areas would be rural, according to that definition.
Great.
And when I was doing the county data, I didn't include Dakota County as being urban because it just seemed to me that it was probably more like communities like, more like Platte County or Dodge County than Douglas County and Sarpy County.
Any other questions for Ann at this point? Okay, well, thank you very much, Ann. I appreciate the overview and information on digital equity. One thing I will reinforce that Ann mentioned at least once is that BEAD and digital equity work very closely together. And yeah, I have to remember for the chocolate or the peanut butter, but they definitely go together, fit together, and are part of a kind of a cooperative process. So appreciate you coming up with that analogy. It's helpful. Okay, let's see, let me get back to slides here. So before I go into some of the 5-year plan details, I just wanted to kind of also reiterate where we are on some of the important timelines. At the top of the screen, there is the NTIA's kind of template timeline. And just wanted to mention that, again, the 5-year plan is kind of that second arrow from the left in blue. We initiated that process on November 15th, where we were given the planning grant funds, and that started the clock essentially on that 5-year plan. We're given 270 days, so 9 months to complete that 5-year plan. I kind of estimated with that second kind of orange arrow where we are now. We're just past the obviously just into 2023. I think those arrows probably need to shift. The blue arrows need to shift slightly to the right to accurately reflect where we started and where we finished. But then the 5-year plan due date is August 12th. So I did put that date in there. A couple other important deadlines that we are cognizant of. We expect that funding announcements will be made on June 30th. So that's that bottom initial proposal, the left side of that blue initial proposal arrow. So June 30th is when we expect that timeline to start. And once that announcement's made, we have 180 days from that point to develop our initial proposal. That would take us to about December 27th. So we expect that we'll be moving along in our 5-year plan when that announcement's made on funding for Nebraska, and we'll be kind of in the process of developing that 5-year plan when we'll also be kicking off the work on the initial proposal, or at least the timeline will be starting on that initial proposal. I think we in a lot of ways have some of that already worked on. But gives you an idea of where things are. again, we expect, at least at this point, that we will be going through the planning processes through most of 2023. So, okay, so on to the 5-year plan. What is it and what is going to be in it? And I'll just say at the outset, a lot of these slides are kind of text heavy, so I apologize for that, but there is a lot of information that is covered in the 5-year plan, so I wanted to make sure I got some of that in there. So the purpose is to essentially present Nebraska's vision for broadband deployment and digital equity. And I'll continue to bring up that digital equity is an important part of this whole process. So it's essentially, to me, taking a look at where the state is now with respect to broadband, defining where it wants to be, and describing how it expects to get there. Part of the process is to develop goals for the state. There's been some efforts to start that kind of goal definition process, but essentially the goals are achievable outcomes. And then with those goals, we're supposed to develop objectives. So objectives are supposed to be specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-based. And those obviously go hand in hand. The goals and objectives are supposed to address closing the digital divide. They're supposed to address issues of deployment. That seems fairly obvious, but also economic growth and job creation, access, adoption, affordability, and digital equity. So those will all be issues that we'll be looking at in our 5-year plan. One of the things we're supposed to do is kind of give an overview of where broadband and digital inclusion is at today. One thing that the Commission has done for a number of years is track a lot of the federal broadband deployment focused programs, and specifically where deployment is happening, how much money is being allocated through federal programs, and where they're being funded. So one thing I'll make mention of, we do have a state broadband map today that you can find at broadbandmap.nebraska.gov. And so if you actually want to see where some of the areas in Nebraska that are covered by some of these programs are, I encourage you to go there. So I would expect that in our 5-year plan, we'll be describing and showing where deployment has happened through the federal programs that you see listed there. The Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, that was a large federally run reverse auction, and there were several areas in Nebraska that were awarded bids through the RDOF, and so we'll obviously be describing that process. The Connect America Fund Phase 2 auction, or CAF2 auction, was somewhat similar, actually a precursor to the RDOF, but it also awarded some areas in Nebraska with federal dollars for broadband service in a few different areas of the state. There are some companies that serve Nebraska today that get what is called Alternative Connect America Model support, or ACAM support. This is support specifically for deployment of broadband capable networks. It's something that we track and incorporate in some ways into our state universal service fund allocation mechanism. And again, something that we will look at including in our 5-year plan as sort of a description of what's happened to date. The USDA Reconnect program is a federal program that has awarded grants in a few areas of Nebraska, really to just one company, but they do provide fiber to the premise through those grants, and so we will describe and show that. And then there was a few months ago a grant award given to a Nebraska tribal entity through the NTIA Tribal Connectivity Program, a fairly significant award. It was, I think, around $35 million for a broadband deployment program. So another thing that we will be describing as we look at where we're at today with broadband. I won't go too deeply into some of the other state state-run programs, because I think we've probably described those quite a bit on previous webinars. But I will mention again, Capital Projects Fund, that grant cycle is open right now. We've supported building broadband capable networks through our State Universal Service Fund, through the Broadband Bridge Program. And then there were also some grants given out by the DED about maybe a year and a half or 2 years ago now through what they call the Rural Broadband Remote Access Grant Program. Again, that was a DED administered program, but something that is that we'll definitely need to describe and cover in our 5-year plan. And then there is at least one locally funded ARPA project that I'm aware of. And so we would expect to describe and include information on that and any other locally funded ARPA projects as well. So another thing that we're supposed to describe in the 5-year plan is what do our current activities consist of? I would expect that in this part of the 5-year plan, we're going to talk about our outreach efforts that we will be planning to do through the BEAD and digital equity programs. We would talk about prior broadband plans and the goals and objectives that were identified to the extent they were in those. There was a broadband plan produced, I think it was right around the 2014 time frame. That was one of the earlier ones that was produced. And then the Rural Broadband Task Force has put together a couple of reports, and I think I put some of the information in one of the wrong bullets there, but Broadband Task Force has a couple of reports that are worth reading and worth incorporating some of the findings into potentially our 5-year plan. And then we'll describe what we do today, our programs through the Nebraska Universal Service Fund and the Broadband Bridge Program, and again, include those in our narrative. This section of the 5-year plan is really just about describing the activities that the program or the office currently conducts, describing any previous activities that have been occurring, and describe any prior experience awarding broadband deployment grants. The next part is encouraging the state to describe what partnerships exist for getting goals achieved. I tried to make just a brief list there of some of the entities that have been part of this discussion so far. It's not meant to be an exhaustive list, but it definitely includes a lot of the entities that we've had discussions with so far. But basically, this is taking a look at the partners that will be engaged in development of the 5-year plan. So if you're not on this list and want to be, I would hope that that's part of the reason why you're attending the webinar. But if you want to have a bigger voice in that, please get a hold of me and we'll make sure that you're included in those discussions. Next part of the 5-year plan discusses asset inventory. So it's essentially looking at what are some of the existing projects that are bringing broadband to Nebraskans, which I've already talked about a little bit. And then some other questions like, is there a sufficient workforce in place to meet the demands of these programs? At this point, we are also encouraged to bring in some information about broadband adoption. I think this is one of probably many areas where we would be working pretty closely with digital equity on some of these, because these are some of the questions that they're addressing, as Ann described, like what percentage of residents within Nebraska have adopted broadband? What programs exist that address digital literacy and digital skills training? What programs exist that provide subsidized or low-cost devices? Are there other awareness campaigns or other programs that exist to help address these issues? Are there programs that carriers themselves conduct to help with broadband adoption. And then what are some of the programs that exist within our K through 12 schools to help students adopt broadband and put devices in their hands to enable them to adopt broadband. And then we're also supposed to look at affordability. So questions like, what programs exist? We know the Affordable Connectivity Program exists for low-income individuals. We know there's a federal Lifeline program that is in place to assist low-income individuals. The Public Service Commission administers a state program that's kind of a companion to the federal Lifeline program. Again, trying to provide access to people that qualify through a number of different programs, and provides them some a subsidy towards monthly service. And then a little bit more of a kind of, I guess, hard point question, like where do public Wi-Fi access points exist, and where does cellular connectivity exist, and where might there be issues with coverage? So you see there on the needs and gap assessment, we're supposed to look at where are the shortfalls, what programs exist to meet the needs where there are voids. And then specifically, where are unserved and underserved areas? One thing I haven't mentioned yet is that we will be relying on the FCC and/or state broadband map to help define where unserved locations exist and what areas qualify as underserved. So that's part of what we are looking to do through our mapping contract, and that happens kind of concurrently with the FCC's development of the federal broadband map. And then once we get information on unserved and underserved areas, we're supposed to also look at what are the costs to serve those areas, and particularly for unserved locations, how will we define where a high cost threshold should be established? So in other words, the notice of funding opportunity tells us to look at, maybe there's a cost above which you wouldn't prioritize fiber to the premise, where you might look at alternative technologies to reach those really, really, really expensive high cost areas. So those are things that we'll be looking at as we go through that needs and gap assessment. And then we're also supposed to identify obstacles and barriers. What significant obstacles and barriers exist that the state might encounter as we try to carry out this 5-year plan? We hear quite a bit about supply chain issues. Is that going to be a barrier to timely deployment of broadband? We would certainly want to describe some of the geographical and topographical challenges that exist in Nebraska to getting broadband deployed. And are there other barriers that the provider community can help us identify? Are there issues with accessing rights of way? Are there other permitting and approval processes that can be tricky? Are they having trouble identifying the necessary labor to carry out these issues? Or are there other issues related to procurement? And I certainly, open it up to other feedback on obstacles and barriers as well. I know there could be specific requirements in the NOFO that might be obstacles and barriers. So I would hope that through our outreach and feedback process that we would hear about those. I know there are letter of credit requirements in the NOFO. Is that something that's going to be a barrier to participation? I think it's important if that is, that we talk about that. I know there are some Buy America provisions in there as well. Is that going to be an issue that we have to deal with? So I'm looking for as much feedback as we can get from outside parties on things like obstacles and barriers. So just a little bit on how we plan to implement all this stuff. We expect that we'll be continuing stakeholder engagement. We think that that will help inform a lot of these aspects of the 5-year plan. There are 5 specific criteria that we are required to address within the 5-year plan. One of them is, or maybe I'll restate that. We have to address these 5 criteria, and I expect this is what the NTIA will be looking at when we turn in the 5-year plan. One is their full geographic coverage of Nebraska and our activities. Did we make an effort to go throughout the state to collect information? Did our efforts with respect to outreach constitute meaningful engagement? So did we meaningfully engage a diverse stakeholder group? And they're going to look at specifically how did we attempt to disseminate this information? Did we try different ways to get the word out? And did we perform outreach in multiple ways? And I think we've talked about that. You know, so far we've largely done it via in-person meetings here in Lincoln and via this webinars. But we think it's important, and I think it's not just important, but required that we, you know, go throughout the state and meet with stakeholders all throughout the state. So that's something that we're working to make a reality. Next thing they're going to be looking for, were there procedures in place to ensure transparency? We you know, I know it's been talked about on multiple occasions, but transparency is extremely important in what we plan to do through this program. So we hope to continue that. And then finally, did the outreach and engagement of unserved and underserved communities occur? I think that'll look closely at what Ann's doing with digital equity, but also with what we're doing on our outreach activities and making sure that those communities that were specifically brought up in the NOFO, that those were that we made an effort to reach out to them. So just a couple things that are important. It's important that we identify our priorities for both deployment, for both BEAD and digital equity. As we've mentioned, probably like half a dozen times now, digital equity and BEAD work closely together. We expect to be working towards a common goal and integrating what Ann's working on with digital equity in the 5-year plan. And then, you know, what are our planned activities going to consist of? Like I mentioned before, I think we'll have a lot more fleshed out plan here soon. Now that Rachel's on board and that we're working towards coming up with an outreach plan. Then we're supposed to identify what's the timeline and cost for universal service. So in other words, when and how much is it going to cost to get service to all of our unserved and to our unserved locations in particular, but also to any underserved locations that we think we can reach. We think that'll be, again, based largely on cost model information that we get through this process, and timeline is kind of to be determined at this point, but something that we'll be kind of asking questions about as we go along. And then technical assistance. What will need to be provided in terms of support to make sure that all of the requirements are met? So all items that we need to address within the 5-year plan. And so with that, I will just kind of stop and hopefully answer any questions that might come up. I think that gives you a pretty good in-depth look at what the 5-year plan consists of and what our activities over the coming months are going to be looking to address. So please put any questions you have in the chat box or just unmute yourself and we'll try to answer them if there are any. I'll just mention a couple more things since it doesn't appear that there are any questions. Some of you might have noticed that the digital equity plan is due on November 30th, I believe, Ann, and our 5-year plan is due in August. So those timelines don't exactly meet, but we expect that as we go through the development of the 5-year plan, that we'll be able to incorporate a lot of what the digital equity group has put together as we put together that 5-year plan. So the digital equity plan won't necessarily be a finished product by the time we complete our 5-year plan, but a lot of what they'll be collecting in terms of information will likely be reflected in our plan. And then finally, the last thing I'll mention really quick, our next webinar is scheduled for, I believe, March 22nd at the same time, 2 o'clock Central Time. So I will just stop and see again if there are any questions. Please chime in if you do have any questions or comments. I did get one question about the PowerPoint presentation and whether that will be posted. I can certainly make that available. I will need to check with Ann just to make sure there's nothing that to make sure that everything on her slides was okay to be posted. But yes, we can certainly make the PowerPoint available. So. Okay, well, I'm not seeing any other questions pop up. So at this point, I appreciate your time and joining the webinar for the month.
Hey, Colin.
Yeah, well, one more.
We actually do have one from Aaron in the Q&A. Will there be a system to identify priority geographical areas, or will it be decided solely on information from the new map?
Can you maybe repeat that one more time, Justin? Will there be?
Yeah. Will there be a system to identify priority geographical areas, or will it be decided solely on information from the new map?
That's a good question. I mean, I kind of envision it being not really an or question. It'll probably be kind of both. I mean, I think there's a requirement that once we identify which areas are what is unserved, so in other words, which locations are unserved, we need to figure out how service is going to get to those locations. And I don't know if that's it still has yet to be determined whether that will be kind of a region by region or how we will address that. But I think the first step is just an identification of which locations are unserved, and then looking at costs and kind of where they're distributed geographically. So hopefully that answers your question, Aaron.
That's all the questions I have right now for you, Colin.
All right, thanks. Appreciate it, Justin. Okay, well, thank you all again for your time and for joining, and we hope to see you again next month, if not sooner. So hope you all have a good afternoon.